All right, everybody, we'll move to our second talk. So Taylor provides us with helping us understand why how, not exactly why, but describes the shift from the disenchanted world to an enchanted world, the notion that we live in an inner frame. But it doesn't really explain how today's culture shapes and forms our social imaginary of today's either secular person or religious person. I'd probably claim we're all kind of religious anyways. So we're going to turn to another Canadian philosopher named James K.A. Smith. And he's got a series of books called Liturgies Project. So 3 books. But he's got one book that summarizes everything. You Are What You Love. I encourage you, that would be a good book to read to get a gist of what he means. But hopefully I can do that as well now. So in his first Liturgy Project book, Desiring the Kingdom, Smith addresses the following questions. What are human beings? What kind of creatures are we? And what are we called to be? Now, right off the bat, what he does is he rejects 2 typical modern understandings of human nature. The human person as thinker and the human person as believer. Human person as thinker, human person as believer. He does not mean that we are not thinkers and we are not believers. He's just saying we are not primarily shaped by this. So the human person as thinker proposes that we are primarily shaped by what we think. Here's the problem with this approach. It does not consider that we are not just minds, kind of on a bobblehead, on a stick, but that we are also embodied creatures who see, touch, hear, and bump into other people and things in the world. I'll say more about that in a moment. In that sense, this model conceives of the person, as Smith says, as thinking things. The human person is a thinking thing, a cognitive machine, defined solely by one's thought and one's rational operations. A prime example of a thinking thing is Data. Remember in Star Trek? Person of Data. Data, the android, not Star Trek, Star Wars, the Next Generation series. And Data there struggles to be human because his computer divine mind can only conceive of himself and the world around him in terms of information, formulations, and algorithms. Okay? So that's what the problem with the person as thinker. Then there's the human person as believer. This model is helpful in that it contests the human person as thinker by pointing out that all thinking are shaped by faith assumptions. Right? All thinking are shaped by faith assumptions. And it argues that thinking never happens in a neutral space and is thus not influenced by someone's belief structure. Now, these belief structures do not just include whether you believe in God, but also whatever philosophical or ideology you assume to be the foundation of your thinking. So again, if we go to the political situation that's going on today, some will argue that there's Marxist, critical thinking, philosophical critical thinking that's influenced a lot of what's going on in our political structure right now. I'm not going to get into the details of it because it's far stretched. But the whole point of it is that the good thing about this human person as believer is it points out to the person as thinker, hey, there are assumptions behind what you think and the way you think. But here's the problem of the person as believer. It fails to recognize that we are formed, again, along with the other one, person as thinker, that we are formed through our bodies, by the way of our senses, and also at a very unconscious level that we don't even realize is happening. The believer model simply moves the clashes of ideas down to the level of clashes of beliefs. Both models fail to consider that we learn not just through our minds, but also through our bodies and socially. For instance, I was a bricklayer before I went to school and now became ordained as an Anglican priest. And how did I learn to be a bricklayer? I was apprentice. And how do you apprentice? You basically get put between two experienced bricklayers and you learn by example. And you just do it. You start doing it, you start laying blocks first, they show you, you carefully go, you watch by example, and just by doing and through bodily actions, etc., you learn how to be a bricklayer. I would suggest that the disciples of Jesus learned the same thing when it came to being followers or disciples of Jesus. They learned bodily as well as what Jesus taught them. He would send them out, go and do this. And they would go and do this. They practiced what it meant to articulate their faith, to help the poor, the needy, etc. So the important thing here Smith wants to say to us is that we're not just thinking things of believers, but that we're also embodied social creatures. And that's why he turns to Augustine's model of the human person as lover. Okay? The human person as lover. So we move from the notion of the human person as thinker, human person as believer, to the human person as lover. Again, he's not suggesting that we don't think and that we don't believe, but he is suggesting that what we ultimately love shapes what we think and what we believe. Now, what's right and good about this human person as lover? One, it recognizes that we're intentional beings. Which one? Rather than assume that we're these sort of static containers for ideas and beliefs just to, throw into, the person as lover is someone who's being in the world, so to speak, is always aiming at something in their daily lives. So Descartes said, we are always conscious of something. In other words, we don't just think. We're always thinking of something. So right now, try to just think without thinking of something. It's possible. You're always thinking of something. You just don't think. But how do we intend something? Well, another philosopher, by the way, Heidegger, says the most fundamental way of intending something is not cognitively, but again, non-cognitively. We do not go around, all day long thinking about, let's say, how to get to work, how to get to school, or as I said before, how I brush my teeth, how I put on my clothes. Most of the time, we simply intuit our way around the world. And the most fundamental way we intend the world is love. So as desiring creatures, Smith calls us desiring creatures, we intend the world in the mode of love that manifests itself in one's desire or longing for something. So to be human is to love, and what we love defines who we are. Okay? So I'm not talking here about loving pizza, nor even talking about your significant love. Like when we say we love our parents or we love our spouse. Smith's talking about ultimate love. That which fundamentally orients and governs our vision of the good life and shapes our being in the world. In other words, here's another way of putting whatever vision of the good life we love, he says we worship. Because that forms your identity. Now, by worship, he's really expanding the definition of worship. He's not just talking about what we do liturgically or other religions do. Okay? He's expanding the notion of worship. But what distinguishes us from each other or gathers us into different communities of people is not whether we love, but what we love. Okay? So let me just stop there. If you have any questions, this notion of person, thinking things to believers, to the notion of person as loving, does that make sense? Do you have any questions about it? You get it? Okay, good. So, to say then that we're intentional creatures entails the second characteristic, that we are teleological creatures. That's a big word for saying that our love is aimed at different ends or goals. We love for a reason. And these aims or goals are whatever visions or pictures of human flourishing we love. Now, these pictures of human flourishing means whatever gives us meaning and purpose in life, have numerous components. It could be, what is a just economy? Source of recreation and play we value. How we ought to relate to the environment. What sorts of work counts as good work? What flourishing families look like? Or love of Canada, our love of Canada and how we respond, etc. Now, it's important to emphasize that our ultimate love is oriented by and towards a picture of what we think it looks like to live well. Because it's that picture, I'll explain more in a minute, that governs, shapes, and motivates our decisions and actions. In essence, this model conceives of the person, as Smith says, that was the wrong page. The picture here is not sort of a set of rules or ideas of a good life. It's something that sort of captures our imagination and our hearts. That's where this idea, this picture, that's where it works. So rather than being pushed by a set of beliefs, our imaginations, in a sense, pull or lure us by whatever picture of human flourishing that attracts our love. And when our imaginations are hooked, we then begin to emulate, mimic, mirror the picture we desire. So let's give some examples. In commercials, etc., that you have out there. What do? They give you a picture of what human flourishing looks like. So they give you a picture of a sports car, a beautiful one besides the sports car, or whatever else, and what life looks like if you buy that sports car. Your imagination is just lured by it. Eventually you buy into it. Not always, of course. But PR people know this very, very well. We are being bombarded all the time by these pictures of human flourishing and what the good life looks like. That deals with that at an unconscious level in our hearts and our imaginations. And so we don't even know it's happening all the time unless we're critically thinking about it or being reflective. It just is happening. So how do these then pictures of human flourishing lure us to love them? A particular vision of human flourishing becomes operative in and through our habits. I've begun to talk about that, our habits in life that often we are not even cognizant of. Habits can refer to virtuous behavior such as patience, courage, kindness, honesty, compassion, or vices like lust, gluttony, anger, pride, acedia. Habits can be mundane activities such as, again, brushing our teeth or picking up a coffee at Starbucks or Tim Hortons every morning. They represent what he calls our default tendencies and automatic dispositions to act in certain ways without even thinking about them, to pursue certain goods, to value certain things, to cherish certain relationships, and so forth. And then these habits that we engage in orient our heart and love such that it is disposed to be aimed in certain directions. So again, what he's trying to say here is, whatever we engage in our habits, even on an unconscious level, that too can shape, along with these pictures that come at us, our love, and thus our desire for certain things. And it all happens often at an unconscious level. Okay? How are these habits inscribed in us? How are these dispositions formed? Where do these inclinations come from? I'll try to explain it a little better here. So we are embodied creatures, and like I said, we feel our way around the world, and the more more than we think around it, and our imagination is then fueled by these images or pictures that are channeled through our senses. How does this happen? Well, as I already said, these pictures of the good life are channeled through our senses into our imaginations from books, stories, films, advertisements, TV commercials, sitcoms, movies, social media, etc. And the visions of the good life that are associated with these, I would call icons or pictures, over time, what they do is they seep into and shape our love and then orient our dispositions and habits toward them. So earlier on, the question was asked, how can people think this way, in the secular way or non-God way, etc.? Well, they're being bombarded by it all the time. Especially with the rise of social media that we are so much a part of. We are being bombarded by these icons and pictures of what they think human flourishing looks like. And it is impacting our imaginations and at a very unconscious level all the time. And then it draws us into certain habits as well sometimes. So the habit of, let's say, turning to social media on our phones all the time. Whether we pray in the offices of, let's say, morning or evening prayer or not, I'll talk more about that later. Even going to Tim Hortons, or whether or not we go to church on Sunday morning. So the practices for young parents, and I remember doing this. Fortunately, my son's hockey didn't happen on Sunday morning, but now the habit of sports is when? Sunday morning. It becomes a habit. Going to church is a habit. It's not just something you do. And therefore, you know what habits are like, right? They can not be easy to follow. Habits become second nature when you're doing it all the time. When you get out of practice of doing the habit, you just stop doing it. So in sum, what Smith's saying is that we are fundamentally creatures of love who desire a vision of the good life, whatever that is. And the vision of the good we choose to love depends upon which pictures and associated habit-forming practices we inhabit. To this point, we have tended to focus on the person as if she were an individual. However, as individuals, even though we may think we don't need community, we are nevertheless formed by social relationships and institutions. In other words, we are shaped by the practices that are themselves embedded in concrete institutions. I'm going to explain this for you now. There's no sense that there are private practices. Our hearts are constantly being formed by our social relationships, most often by cultural institutions we create. Okay? So I'll give you an example. Cultural institutions that we create can be hospitals, corporations, university, the CBC, the markets, the church. They're all institutions we've created, right? What happens after a while? These institutions then take on a life of their own. And while they are ultimately human creations, once they are up and running, they take on a nature of their own to try to influence us. They take on a kind of systemic power over individuals that seek to form us into certain types of human beings. The church is a prime example of it. So are universities, though. They're trying to turn their students and eventually the culture into certain types of people. So are media outlets such as the CBC. They have an agenda. Most media outlets have a particular political agenda. And they're trying to shape through their pictures and their information gathering and all that sort of stuff into a certain type of person. In other words, cultural practice and institutions, Smith calls them liturgies. Again, he's expanding the notion of liturgy from what we do on Sunday morning. But their pedagogies, he calls them of ultimate desire. And they seek and try to shape us all the time. You just see. So, our cultural criticism, just to conclude, and we can hopefully talk more about this in a moment. I'll try to, explain things better if you haven't quite understood some of it. Is our cultural criticism should not just be about asking what ideas or beliefs are being bandied about in a culture. Rather, we should be discerning what ends our institutions are seeking to direct our life. That's what we really need to ask. That's the question we fundamentally need to ask. What end are our institutions seeking to direct our life? Political organizations, media organizations, universities, when we're at work, our workplace, they're all at an unconscious, deep level trying to shape your love towards a certain end. Okay. Questions? From believer, thinker to believer to lover. What makes you into a person is what you ultimately love, and pictures that are coming at you all the time, and the habits that these different pictures draw you into try to shape what you ultimately love and worship. Go ahead.
Well, I was only thinking about, this tension between duty and desire, and how kind of what it could be like if what we thought ought to do and what we wanted to do were good.
What the tension between the two?
Well, one what you could say, right? The good life, as a Christian, let's say, right? The good life would be that if what you ought to do and what you wanted to do were ultimately good.
Right. You ultimately want those two to come together.
Right, except that's not how we
do
it at all.
No. And what probably didn't explain it very well, but the point of engaging in, and I'm going to talk about this in the last talk a bit, our habits are really important. What habits we choose are very important to fundamentally what we become and shape and how our love is shaped, whether as Christians or not as Christians. And those habits are involved in shaping us so that what we want to do is more in line with what we ought to do. So, for instance, those who love to run, when you first start running, you don't want to run. Okay? It's a duty. It's a chore. You just commit, I'm going to run 3 times a week. And it hurts. And you don't like doing it. After a while, some runners get this experience. I really enjoy this. I get even a high out of this. And eventually, their want and duty come together. Right? But the habit has shaped the two to come together. Now, why the person got there in the first place is because this person had some sense of picture that running is good for me. Let's say, okay? It didn't just come out of nowhere, but somehow this notion of running is good for me in my life, and so the person was shaped by that, and then decided to engage in a certain habit towards that end, and then eventually what I want and my duty came together. Is that helpful? Is that helpful what you're saying? Yeah.
I'm still not making the connection with all you talking through the liturgies.
Yeah. he talks about, he wrote this a while ago, so I'm not sure if this is appropriate today, but he talked about shopping malls being a prime example of where liturgies happen, where you walk into malls and you have pictures of items being sold that give you the impression that this is going to make you happy. And so you engage in the practice of whatever, walking through malls and what that practice involves, and maybe stopping at the kiosk of all the foods and having your food there. But in a sense, the shopping mall is like a church, sort of a secular cathedral that you walk into. And like a lot of seniors spend time in malls, especially in the winter. They go there for walks and they have their coffee and all that sort of stuff. And maybe they're being influenced by I don't know. But he was giving that as an example. I think universities can be considered a sense of church that provides certain liturgies and practices that you engage in that then shape your mind on campus through extracurricular activities, etc. Except my extracurricular activities at university was more drinking and stuff like that. But their practices, it's kind of a liturgy. This is the accepted liturgical practices you engage in, and that shapes you. Yeah.
I was so I read the book, K.A. Smith, You Are What You Love, and I particularly enjoy this aspect of secular liturgies. It's sure the mall example might be old, but it's the things that other institutions invite us to repeat, over and over and over and over again, right? Like Meta, which is Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and all that. Like Meta, the group, it invites me to scroll. It invites me to keep going. It invites me to click on their app. It invites me to hit like, love, or whatever. So those are the things it invites me to do over and over and over again. So like that's social media liturgy. And then we have the liturgy of being in university, right? Like coming out of university. It's the social liturgy of, hey, it's Friday night. Where are we going to party? Who's going to get the drink, right? Who's going to get the snack? That's like the social liturgy of a university life. Mm-hmm. As we grow older, it's just funny enough, I see this in our churches, right? Like it is, who are your friends that are inviting you to come play cards more often, right? And then what kind of conversations are we having around the card table, right? Because it's not like novel conversations every time we get together. It's the same thing that we talk about. And then what do they invite us to do, right? Where are they inviting us to go? I've often found that if once we're retired, it is going to a certain place to eat because I want to enjoy something very specific, right? Or I'm going to hang out with a certain kind of people or do a certain activity because it brings me around a certain kind of people that I want to become friends with. So when I was in Bath, it was the painters that would gather every Tuesday, every Friday, and they would talk about where they're going to have their exhibitions, what kind of clients they're going to get. And the church has its own liturgy, right? Like it is what forms us through repetitions. It is what are the things that give us habits. What is it inviting us to do again and again and again? But then what I think where you're going is, and at the end, what is it inviting us to ultimately love?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But those habits form what you love as well, yeah. Right? And the thing I think you're really helpful in pointing out there, I just was thinking of from the past talk, when our culture was it, everybody believed in God. Kind of the habits of the culture and the church coincided to a degree, right? Like the old days in little Anglican towns and churches of England where everybody come together and everybody's practicing saints days together. Like even in Europe, in Italy, when I go to visit my relatives in Italy, The saints' days are still the focus and center of celebrations and communal festivities. So there's this a leftover, I think a healthy leftover, of a connection when the culture and church Christian life is more assimilated. But when that falls away, those kind of habits are replaced by other habits, right? And one big habit, one big liturgy is liturgy of the hockey rink, which I very much would participate in because my son played a lot of hockey. There's a whole way of life for parents in this sports culture, which then involves going to tournaments and spending $1 gazillion and all that sort of stuff. I totally sucked into it. I have to admit, I was sucked into it. But that shapes and forms you too.
You know what I was thinking about? Kevin made a comment in the middle of these, kind of just listened to it. He said one of the things that was lost in kind of the more Protestant movement was the veneration of the saints. Is that what you said? And
Yeah.
I was thinking about that in light of this, and I wrote it down because the vision of the good life used to be the saint, right? That was the liturgical draw of having a saint there. Look at Saint Augustine. Look at Saint Teresa or whoever. That's good. To have a holy life in communion with God. That's what the goal is. And then now we don't really do much saints days, right? The majority of the church, the more liturgical churches, Anglicans, Catholics, they do it. But the evangelical churches, it's not a thing that happens. We don't gather on a Tuesday afternoon or an evening to do a saint day. And in that sense, we've lost this vision of a good life in the church. Now the vision of a good life, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Please do tell me if I'm wrong. Is, the pastor, the priest, right? That's the vision of the good life. I don't know. I struggle with that.
That's a good point. Go ahead, yeah.
Just pick up on the saints. A couple things about names for children. I spent 4 years after I retired from Redeemer working at University of Wisdom College in Mary's Bay, Catholic liberal college.
Yeah.
There, they were very, very devout, very committed through faith to Christ. Well, everybody who had children, every one of them would be given the saint's name.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that particular saint, the parents would choose it, hoping and praying, in fact, praying for the child's whole life, that child would in fact follow some of the virtues of that particular saint. Well, there's an enormous difference between that and when people, I grew up with in the Reformed Protestant world, often there would be biblical names and the Reformed tradition, often a lot of Old Testament names in my Jacob. But that's something that you're reminded constantly. This is how you're in the covenant. Learn from that name. But then when you go to just choosing names because you think they're whimsical or interesting,
No, agreed.
there's an enormous difference that's happening in our culture just in the naming of children.
I think that's a prime example. Yeah, I think that's a prime example. The whole thing about the saints, where I was going to talk about more in the last talk, about these resources we have within the life of our church. Now, I'm going to speak particularly from the Anglican tradition, but there are other traditions that can do the same thing, that we have the resources to draw from to help shape our love and desires. How to get people into it, that's another question. But it's interesting, Noel's point where he says there's big shift of looking to the rector or the priest to model. And to be fair, that's always been there to a degree. There's always been there to a degree. But there has been a shift away from, we don't actually have to take too much responsibility as a lady when it comes to virtuous behavior. You're going to do it for us. Mm-hmm. Or often, I remember when I heard my first parish, I was set up to fail like that because I was relatively young at the time and they say, you're going to bring in all the young people. You are going to bring in all the young people. That's wrong-headed. Like, of course, bringing someone in like Noel, young, energetic, is going to draw in some young people. But it can't just be based on that. That's not going to work. Because what happens is, yeah, it might do a bit of a bump. And then when he's gone, what happens? There has to be something else that's happening communally all together. We're all engaged in various different habits of worship and virtuous behavior and all this sort of stuff that we'll talk about in a moment. That then will may attract both young and old into the life of the parish. That I'm seeing happening in certain, tending more in the Roman Catholic and Pentecostal churches. But the potential is for it to be happening here and other places as well, I think. Any other question?
What is the vision of the Christian good life?
We're going to talk about it.
Oh, we're talking about
We're going to talk about that. Yeah. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
What is the vision? What is the Christian understanding of good life? And to what end?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're confused around that sometimes. Yeah.
Just a more personal anecdote about I was overwhelmed this week by commercials that's on television. I should say that I don't watch television. I read. My reading is what I do every day. But once a year, I start watching baseball. And my late wife, Kathleen, was an ardent baseball fan, was an ardent reader. She used to laugh at me because she said, well, you're an October Blue Jay fan. Well, I've watched a number of the Blue Jay games in the week last week, this week. But because I never watched television, I was actually bowled over by the commercials. Because in terms of the good life, I mean, they had these magnificent commercials of people's lives transformed because of this new vehicle. And I realized, and the interesting thing there, in the course of a 2.5 hour, 3 hour game, you see the same commercial several times
Over and over.
And I realized, because I don't watch television, it hit me in a way that was just overpowering, that's the good life. Look at that car, everything can change, right? But that's, when I think about the fact that people who watch television all the time, they get bombarded with those images.
And that's exactly what Smith's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Smith's talking about. They're not trying to get at your sense of your mind, your thinking, even what you believe. They're trying to get at your imagination and your heart. And get that picture into you over and over again and somehow lure you into it. Now, what's worse with sports is there are these betting over and over and over again. And then they do a little message. Oh yeah, by the way, if you have some betting problems here, you can do it. Like, the inconsistency of the message is incredible. It really is. But that's the message. That's the message to good life.
Unfortunately, I find that the press continues to tell you how bad things are.
That's true.
But they don't point out some of the reasons that's putting us there, like people who are going to food banks now are people who can afford to buy food, but they use that money for the gambling
Right.
on the TV instead.
That's right.
And next thing you know, we are suffering this continuous depression because everything about us is so bad. And I think that's an area that Christians are going to have to speak more about.
Yes.
Churches are going to have to speak.
Yeah.
Because when we get people into our pews, looking at us and looking for guidance, we need to find a way to show some of the things that we can spread.
Yeah. And I'm going to talk about that because I do think there's a process to getting them there.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. And that means that the believing and the thinking part doesn't go out the window either. I'm just trying to undermine that all the time. Because sometimes you do want to do some instruction like we're doing now and to understand things. But the big starting point is how do we lure them with and through their imagination and heart's desire, as opposed to letting the culture do it for them. That's the big question.
What is strange, I had that question yesterday from my son.
Oh yeah?
He came to Canada when he was 6 years old. And he asked me what life was like back in Antigua. If
Oh,
there's any stress, depression, or anything like that, and how I grew up.
Yeah.
I said, I grew up differently to what you're facing now here in Canada because I didn't know what stress was all about.
Right.
And my parents said to me, this is what you have today, and this is what we're going to have, and this is what it's going to be. And
Just
we were
focus on
happy
today.
with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were happy with that, but it's different today. The kids today, I keep saying, it's so much around them, so they think differently, and you cannot have everything you want.
I know.
You
I think you got
So I said to him, I wasn't depressed growing up, and I felt happy with what I had, and the same way I raised him, right? Because he's big now. And I remember one day he came back to my home, and he said, Dad, he was there today, and he said, Dad, this is my home. And he had his home. And he said, this is my home. And I said, yeah, anytime you can come.
Of course.
And he said, I know now why you tell me, sometimes when I asked for something when I was much younger, wait until next week. He said, wait until next week. I said, why? Because he had kids now of his own. And he know that he can't get everything when they want it.
No.
It was such a good conversation we had.
Oh, that sounds good.
I personally have no social media presence, which makes a lot of people chuckle. I watch TV, but I record everything. I go right through the advertisements. I was watching the news, but it thoroughly depressed me. I'm not watching it now. Believe me, life is a lot better. I don't have all these outside info. I guess I do, without knowing it, but I don't have all this bombardment that we've been talking about. I'm an old fart, and I'm happy to be one.
No, I think both of you are actually bringing up a really interesting point because my parents immigrated from Italy in the early 50s after World War II. They had very little, but they were happy. Their world was relatively small. It was poor. But my wife often brings this up too. With social media, the world's become much bigger. And it does bombard us. And it's a fact. The problem is, what's that expression? Something's out of the box, whatever. What's that expression?
The cat's out of the box.
Cat's out of the box or whatever. It's out. It's not like you can all of a sudden push it back in. But at least we can critically think about, not let it shape us. That's what I want to say. But what kind of habits and practices that we'll talk about in the last talk can we engage in so that those things are not shaping us to the detriment? Right.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm gonna